Hello, my name is Xenophon Babadimitris, and I'm a professor of biomedical informatics and data science at Yale. This is part of our series of guest expert interviews that's sort of supplementary material for a certificate program in medical software, medical AI. Our guest today is Eric Henry. Mr. Henry is a senior quality systems and compliance advisor at the law firm of King and Spalding and works out of the Cleveland area remotely. He joined the company in 2018 after 30 years of managing various global technical and regulatory compliance organizations in industries, and in particular in medical devices. So we're going to have a chat about the state of AI regulations, both here in the US and globally, and then we'll touch a little bit about this sort of nebulous area of hospital-developed AI systems and the challenges, the mostly unknown challenges that people working on them face. So we'll hope to illuminate that a little bit. So Eric, thanks for doing this. Tell us a little bit more about you. How did you get here? You're a non-lawyer in a legal firm. What is your role? What do you do?
Yeah, thanks, Inyos, and I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you. Yeah, like most people that have a lot of gray hair or no hair, like me, we didn't. And if you're in the regulatory and quality space, you didn't get there in a straight line, and I'm no exception to that rule. My background is in software engineering and business management and quality systems and compliance over the years. And I started outside the medical device industry in IT departments for large companies, worked for a while at the NASDAQ stock market. I actually ran the Y2K program for NASDAQ back in the day when people thought that was a scary thing. In about 2002, I picked up an opportunity after the dot-com bubble burst and the telecom bubble burst, and I'm in the Washington, D.C. area wondering what's going to happen next. Decided to find an industry that was a little less prone to those gyrations, and got into the medical device industry. My first medical device company, which was Hologic, and we focused on breast imaging and other X-ray technologies there. And I was part of the team that put our first digital mammography system in place, as well as the design team for the tomosynthesis system there as well. Moved from there to run, software quality at Boston Scientific, and then on a global level at GE Healthcare for a while. I ran the software design controls function at the corporate level there for them. Decided I want to get my hands dirty again in a business, so I went to Medtronic's diabetes business and ran several technical and quality functions within that organization out in California. Went to Philips after that to run quality assurance and quality engineering for the Diagnostic Imaging Business Group, which is about 14 sites worldwide across 7 or 8 businesses. That had me on the road a lot. I probably had 80% travel, and about 80% of that was international. So that was a very tiring role. I started to look for maybe what my next thing would be, and was working with King and Spalding folks during that period, helping advise us on a few matters. And one of them walked up to me and knew I was sort of trying to figure out what I was going to do next, and said, well, how about doing something completely different with your career? And so I left industry in 2018 to go to work for King and Spalding's FDA and life sciences practice. And as you said earlier, I'm a non-attorney advisor in a law firm. So we've got, several dozen attorneys specific to FDA work, probably another couple of hundred that do healthcare work more broadly. And I do a wide variety of things with them. Every day is different. It ranges from due diligence for merger and acquisition work, a little bit of expert witness work. I do a lot of quality system remediation and assessment type programs, help people with internal investigations, enforcement actions from the FDA. So it's a pretty wide-ranging role, and every day there's some existential sort of happening going on at a company where we jump in and help out. So it's been pretty exciting the last 6 years.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing you had mentioned I'd like to hear a little bit more about is you also have a community role. You are sort of involved with committees and things. So maybe just tell us a little bit about that, just so we have the full picture before we go.
Yeah. So the one nice thing about leaving industry and going to work for the firm that I work for now is it's given me an opportunity to really become a lot more involved in the in sort of committee work and some authoring and teaching and presenting a little bit more than I had done before. But I am involved with the AFDO-RAPS healthcare collaborative, healthcare products collaborative, where I am on the strategic committee for the AI portion of that collaborative. I co-lead the Good Machine Learning Practices working team, which is currently, our current project is actually doing a mock submission, mock AI submission using a predetermined change control plan to the FDA. We have FDA participants on that mock submission. I also do a little bit of advisory work for the Coalition of Health AI, where I help a couple of the working groups there kind of work through not only what they're doing in the healthcare space and the point of care space with healthcare institutions and academic institutions, but in that process help them consider how that might be impacted by medical device regulations, if they want to expand the scope of that work at some point into the med tech area, what that might involve and how that might change some of the work that they're doing. So that's most of my role there. And I also do a little bit of work for the Pathway for Patient Health program in doing guest lectures for university students on medtech.
Mm-hmm. We'll get back to your work with healthcare institutions and AI at the end, I guess. So let's start here. So the FDA has, if you read them, they will say they've been doing AI for 30 years. The reality is that most of what they've been doing is probably in the last 5 years, with first the explosion in imaging, and now at least with text tools knocking on the door. Not sure that those are there yet, but we're going to see. It's inevitable that that's going to happen, or at least they will get us submissions. Whether they will let anything through is another story.
Yeah, that's right.
So as you put your hat on from before when doing software work, before AI, now in this new year of AI, just let's talk a little bit about what's the state of affairs, what's different when AI is involved. Like if you have a software tool and now you think, I'm going to add an AI component, what changes in my relationship with the FDA? What are they going to want to know? Just, a big, broad overview for people who mostly new to the space, I guess.
Yeah, the thing that shocks people when I talk about this particular topic in a variety of settings is that there is currently zero enforceable regulatory literature in the whole world that has been published and released that is applicable to medical device companies. Zero. That seems odd given the number of white papers and the EU AI Act is out, and we have the FDA's published a predetermined change control plan draft guidance. They've published these guiding principle documents with MHRA and Health Canada, MHRA being out of the United Kingdom. And yet, none of those documents have either been released, or if they have been released, do they constitute enforceable regulatory expectations and requirements? So we are currently still in sort of the draft phase of regulatory expectations that impact medical device companies, or the transition phase in some cases, like the EU. That being said, you have to lean back on existing regulatory frameworks that have existed for decades in some cases. We have the mid-1990s, the quality system regulations, still in force, still in use. We're obviously doing some transition work that will take effect in February of 2026, but that's been around since the mid-90s. The software development lifecycle standards have been around since 2006, and we're still using those, and those are still applicable. So from the standpoint of just the general design controls, software design controls, the standards we use, the regulations we use, we're using the things that we've been using for the last several decades. But with that being the case, the FDA still has certain expectations when people do submissions, for instance, to clear or approve AI-enabled medical devices. And so without having clearly stated in a piece of regulatory literature what they want to see, we do see examples in deficiency letters and submissions where they're asking how algorithms are trained. What kind of algorithm is it? Is it locked? Is it continuous learning? Does it use neural networks and so on? Where did the training data come from? How is that being controlled? What are the different transparency aspects that you've deployed in your life cycle? And we also see some of these good machine learning practice principles that they published again with MHRA and Health Canada being incorporated into the submission review process without technically being a part of a regulatory requirement. And so we do see changes in the behavior of the agency when an AI-enabled device is submitted, but it's very murky because the expectations that they've communicated um, sometimes are not well known until you're already in the middle of a transaction with them.
I guess just to follow up on that. So with a lack of clear document, I mean, look, part of the problem here is I know they're involved in a draft writing process and it's going to, and technology is racing faster than their ability to write seems to be
Yep.
right, which means that anytime they think they're getting close, something else happens. But leaving that aside, so you are now responsible for a submission or you're thinking about a submission. How much ad hoc work goes on there? Like, is it up to the individual reviewer? Do they have internal policies that they use? Like, how is it? Because there's no published policy. So, but there's clearly emerging precedent, consensus, word of mouth. Because if I talk to people like you and others who've done this kind of work, I hear things, right? The FDA expects data from 3 sites for your testing, and they need, like, is this written somewhere, or is this all, well, this is what they asked last time, so now we're all compiling intelligence for the next time we go.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a little bit of yes and no to your question. If we do look at these guiding principle documents that they've published, and there are three of them, one around good machine learning practices, one around transparency, and one around predetermined change control plans, they do provide some insight into what the FDA might communicate back to you when they're reviewing a submission. We also do have the predetermined change control plan draft guidance, which the FDA has been using to review predetermined change control plans for AI-enabled devices. And of course, on a separate topic, they've now expanded to a new draft guidance for medical devices more broadly. So we do see some documentation that gives us a sense of what they might expect. And they have some web pages on the FDA website that give you a little bit of insight, but it's all sort of puzzle pieces scattered across the table that you're trying to figure out how they go together based on these different sources. There is likely some internal informal documentation at the FDA. We don't have access to that. And I think one of the things that drives any consistency at all at the agency right now is that the vast majority of submissions that are AI enabled are in a single OHT or a single review team, Office of Health Technology. And that's the team that reviews radiological devices. Most AI submissions, 85+%, are in the radiology space. So it's the same team reviewing one after another of these, and they've developed some consistent practices internally that they begin to deploy time after time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just looking at this space, and there's a million white papers. And Amy had that, what is it, the technical report 34971,
Right.
which I read it when it came out and it was obsolete the moment it was published practically, which just doesn't reflect on the people who wrote it. It just reflects on.
Yep. Yep. And by the way, I actually, as we're recording this, I just posted something on LinkedIn based on a conversation I had with some folks involved in the technical committee at ISO that runs the risk management standards. They have taken that AMI TIR 34971, which is the application of the risk management standard 14971 to AI-enabled devices. And that is now sitting in an ISO committee to globalize that thinking in that US centric report to a guidance that will accompany the risk management standard, taking that thinking, putting it in the global ISO sort of literature. And my understanding is, it is in committee draft now, and it'll be open for review and vote here very soon. So that'll be a very encouraging forward step.
Yeah, we'll see what comes out of it. So, okay, we naturally moved outside the US. So let's continue on that journey.
Sure.
In addition to the US, of course, there is the rest of the world, and companies that play in the space tend to want to sell everywhere just to make up for their investment. And so, what is the state of AI regulation in the other big areas that we see? The EU, China, perhaps?
Yeah, so China obviously they have quite a few documents out there that function as guidance and regulatory requirements. They have they were in fact one of the first countries to publish a finalized guidance document around what the submission requirements are for AI-enabled devices. It's a very what many of us would be what we many of us would consider to be a very invasive guidance. They want to see a great amount of material that many of us would consider to be intellectual property and company confidential, but they want that exposed as part of the submission. One other very interesting thing about that guidance is that 3 times in the guidance document from China, they're explicit in that they will only review locked algorithms. And they say that outright. They will not review any algorithm that uses autonomous learning or is adaptive, changing itself in the field without human intervention. We know that Singapore and South Korea have also published some documents and have something sort of out there to look at. Saudi Arabia has some things. These are all relatively small countries. Obviously, the big bear is in the European Union with the AI Act. That's the one that everybody sees as the train running down the track. It was earlier this year. It was released, published, and the good news is for medical device companies is you don't have to instantly scramble to adapt to its requirements. It'll be probably 2027 before its requirements are imposed on medical device companies. So we see that happening. One very interesting complexity here, though, is that under the EU AI Act, and some of your previous speakers may have addressed this as well, most medical devices are considered high risk, regardless of the level of risk that they have been assigned under the EU medical device regulations. And so there's some interesting plays here and dynamics that we have to worry about in the European Union with the EU AI Act requirements for high-risk devices and the EU medical device regulations as they apply to various levels of risk. There's also the interaction around notified body audits that will show that you comply with the Act and with the requirements of the medical device regulation. Is that one audit or two? Can we do it in one? Do we have the technical expertise in the notified bodies? Do we have the bandwidth in the notified bodies? And I think what we're seeing as a result of this is a furtherance of apprehension in the industry overall to go to the EU first to release their products. 10 years ago, statistically speaking, 80% of companies, or roughly 80% of companies would go to the EU to market their products versus about 20% that might go to the US first, if you had a choice between those two markets. Since the implementation of the medical device regulation, that has completely flipped. It's about 80%. UCLA and the Boston Consulting Group a couple of years ago published a study. It is almost exactly reversed. About 80% will go to the US first just because of the stability and the predictability of our regulatory structures versus about 20% that will go to the EU first. I see the AI Act and the still very prevalent inconsistencies and volatility of the MDR state as either keeping that the same or making it worse for the EU markets. And they are already experiencing device shortages as a result of this. So I know that sounds a little off topic, but I don't think it really is, because I see that we do see the AI Act coming to play with devices that are going to be enabled, and there's some inconsistencies and conflicts that have to be resolved between that and the medical device regulation. I just think it's going to make the EU market even harder to get into and to understand what the requirements are, and people are going to gravitate toward other markets first, and the US will be one of those.
Let's just review where we are with the MDR, right? It came out in 2017. It was supposed to be implemented in 2020.
Right.
Where are we with that? 2030 by the time they're...
Yeah, it's a moving target. Every time we have information that a bolus of medical device manufacturers have not yet complied or been certified of their products to the medical device regulation, and they complain that it's because of the lack of bandwidth at the notified bodies, the inconsistency between notified bodies, the time frames that are required to get things done. They complain to the European Commission and other governing bodies there in the European Union, and eventually those dates get moved back. And I think we're now in the second or third move. And so as we are still trying to put in a line in the sand on when the EU medical device regulation will be absolutely imposed, no exceptions for every medical device manufacturer. Now there are already proposed changes to the medical device regulation to address some of these issues and others. So it creates an even more volatile situation in an already volatile implementation program for the regulation.
So as a sidebar for those of you who listen to this, and the medical legislation comes out in 2017, it's a significant tightening of the previous regime in Europe, which is why this flip happens. Notified bodies are private companies that do review. Instead of going to the FDA in Europe, you have to deal with them. And I guess what you are alluding to is that for the AI Act, there's going to be a different set of notified bodies. Do you need to go to two of them, or will one be able to do it? And
Right.
just correct me if I'm wrong here, but a big part of the problem is that there are not enough notified bodies basically at this point to handle.
That's
And
right.
nothing is being grandfathered in, correct? Like if you
Right.
need to go through re-review for the new rules, and assume that's going to apply to the AI Act too. There's no, if you were on the market before, that's okay. You are being re-reviewed for compliance. So
That's right. You are, and you're right. There was people. The industry was already terrified when the medical device regulation came out because many notified. One of the reasons the MDR came out was because they were getting under the medical device directive, the predecessor to the MDR, very inconsistent and kind of sloppy behavior among many notified bodies. And this was supposed to raise the bar on what notified bodies were required to do and the standards that they were supposed to audit against and maintain in those relationships with their manufacturing customers. And many notified bodies just said, "Not worth it for me. I'm not doing it." And so we were terrified that there were not going to be enough notified bodies. And sure enough, in the early days, when people started trying to get notified bodies' attention, it would sometimes take 6 months to a year to even get on their calendar. It might be another 6 months to a year or year and a half before that entire process was complete and you could get something cleared. It was really bad. And just now, we're starting to get enough notified bodies to feel like we might be able to start reducing the time frames to get products released in the European market. And just as that starts to happen, now these notified bodies, if you have a high-tech AI-enabled device, have to start auditing you against the Act, against the AI Act as well. And a lot of them simply don't have the expertise. The goal is that you would obviously in a single audit be able to audit against both sets of requirements, but that assumes a lot in terms of bandwidth, skill set, time availability. It's just going to be a problem.
okay, so staying with the theme of upheaval, we're doing a radio show here. Let's come back to the US. The
Yeah.
FDA is in the middle of trying to figure out what it's doing with generative AI. There are a couple of draft papers circulating. There's a meeting. By the time, of course, this thing comes out, the meeting may have already happened, but there's a meeting in November to discuss these things. While we're not getting into the politics of it, there is a new administration which could also make changes. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on all that. And, what is the scope of changes that's typical with a new administration? You've seen a few of them
Yeah.
over the years. I mean, we're not going to worry about the rights and the wrongs of it, but there's all the practical implications.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be helping to run an AI summit the week after we record this, where we have some policy level folks in the room, and I'll be moderating, and we're going to be asking those very same questions because it's on everybody's mind. What will the new administration bring, or how do agencies like the FDA, and if you're in the AI world, you need to worry about more than the FDA, the FTC, the Office of National Coordinator for Health IT, the Office of Civil Rights within Health and Human Services. these are all agencies that if you're AI-enabled device, you also need to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
And all of them have sort of policies in place whenever there's a change in administration where they slow their roll in terms of putting out new guidance, new regulatory requirements, proposed rules, finalizing rules. I can tell you that I talked to one, I'll leave it as an unnamed federal agency. I talked to one of those representatives just earlier this week, and they have a proposed rule out right now, and it won't be finalized until after the new administration comes into place. And they're very nervous. They're not sure what's going to happen to their proposed rule. One of the things I saw on the FDA side is that prior to the end of the last fiscal year, which in the US federal government ends at the end of September, the new fiscal year starts October 1st, they were supposed to finalize the predetermined change control plan guidance for AI devices and publish a draft guidance for the AI lifecycle, software lifecycle for medical devices. They didn't meet either of those deadlines. And now that we are past that, they have republished their list. Both of those documents are back on the A list for getting done before the end of this fiscal year. But one of the things that we've noticed is the FDA has been nearly silent with publishing new guidances and new requirements and speaking about what new rules might be coming out since probably about a month before the election. And now since the election, very quiet. This is just my personal opinion, but I don't expect FDA to publish anything significant until well into the new administration, because there will be changeovers in at the cabinet level. There will be changeovers, and the commissioner of the FDA and other heads of subdepartments of Health and Human Services and other government agencies like Commerce and Justice. And then with that, there will be new philosophies about, and they may or may not be philosophies about what's appropriate, but they may be philosophies that change the priorities of where what they will focus their attention on and want to release more quickly than other things. So we might see anything from a rolling back of certain things that were a priority to a simple moving of the timelines where things shift in order. One of the things that we have already been told is that it is quite likely that the White House executive order on AI, which does have some life science and medical device implications, is likely to be rolled back, and that executive order is likely to be canceled. So that will change a lot of things in terms of where both government agencies and industry was trying to head. It's quite likely that the role of NIST and a lot of the frameworks and AI publications that they've created will instead of being referred to as sort of the basis for a regulatory expectation, may simply be promoted as a guidance or guideline for people to follow. But that may be the sum total for some time of what we have in terms of expectations from the government on these types of systems.
Yeah. And unspoken in all this is that it might be 6 months before these appointments are filled, which will
Absolutely.
because that's what happens in the US when a new administration comes, right? A whole top layer of the federal government gets replaced.
There's over 4,000 positions that the new administration will have to fill that are political appointees. They will all have to go through Senate confirmation. Love or hate the way the election turned out, the fact that the White House administration is of the same political party as that in charge in the Senate, which is what we will have beginning in January. The Senate is likely to confirm those appointees more rapidly than if it had been another party in charge. So that will accelerate things to some extent, and it'll give us a little bit of clarity, maybe sooner than we'd have in other circumstances, but it's still going to take some time.
So, okay, so let's just go on to the last topic, and I know this is what you're really thinking about right now, which is, okay, leaving the FDA world aside, although it's there in the background of this, one of the big changes with AI right now is that a lot of hospitals are getting into the game, medical schools, and thinking, okay, look, medical schools and academic hospitals, we're not developing their own CT scanners or mammography systems. But now this is software, so the cost of entry is a little lower.
Right.
All the data lives in hospitals, which gives these institutions some unique resources perhaps that companies don't have access to. We haven't talked about data privacy, but that's another leg of this story.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of hospitals, academic institutions, health systems are beginning to develop tools in-house for better or worse, and there's some expertise that's unique there. And to some large extent, this feels to them at least, and I've had some conversations, that's outside the FDA purview, right? This is not a product, this is not being sold. But I know you have some thoughts on this story, so I'm going to just stop here and let you take it wherever you want to go with it.
Yeah. When I wake up screaming in the middle of the night, this is typically the dream that caused it. Um, uh, the The FDA is prohibited within the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act from regulating what Congress termed the practice of medicine. And there were some constraints around what that actually means. And the intent was that they don't want the FDA telling an individual physician how to use medicines or medical devices that they have, that they are using, that physician has the authority and the ability to use them however they see fit. And if they want to make some tweaks or modifications or even use them off market, in other words, in a way different than what the intended use or the claims cleared by the FDA have published, that's their prerogative as a physician. They can do that.
Let me stop you just to give a concrete example, or maybe help me understand it. So
Yeah.
we hear a lot about off-label drug use, right, in medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So a drug has to go through clinical trials, it gets approved for a specific disease,
Yep.
then it gets used off-label. So just correct me here, as far as the FDA is concerned, you have approval, so now you can sell the drug. As a doctor, I can buy it, but what I use it for is sort of a little bit in practice of medicine. Is that the sort of
Yep.
thing?
That's absolutely. And in the medical device context, a good example would be an insulin pump, a diabetic insulin pump, right? Some of these, when they're initially cleared or approved, they're approved for adult patients. And yet a huge percentage of type 1 diabetics are pediatric patients. And so an endocrinologist can say, even though this device is cleared for adults, I think it's appropriate for use in your 6-year-old child who has diabetes. And I'm going to allow that 6-year-old child to use this insulin pump. I'm going to prescribe it for them. They're allowed to do that, even though it was not approved by the FDA for that patient population. Now, how this applies to AI and machine learning. Hospitals, especially research institutions, health systems, they have been, as you say, developing AI and innovating in artificial intelligence at a very rapid pace. But they have maintained that work, almost regardless of its intended use, meaning that it could fall within the technical definition of a medical device or sort of does not meet the exemption requirements the FDA has defined for clinical decision support systems, for instance. And they will claim that even if that's the case, because they are doing it, developing it inside the hospital system, that constitutes the practice of medicine, and that the FDA doesn't have authority there. Where this is tricky is that theory has never really been tested in court yet. And the FDA, in a final rule that may be subject to revision or retraction in the next administration, we'll see, which is the laboratory developed test final rule, saying that laboratory developed tests, the FDA has considered those to be medical devices and they must be cleared as medical devices, caused a great deal of uproar for a variety of reasons we won't go into. But what's germane in that rule to our topic is that in one of the sections of the preamble to that rule, the FDA addressed this notion of regulating the practice of medicine. And they made a statement that in my conversations with people from the FDA, they say was intentional and yes, applicable even to the AI space. That they feel that industry, including health systems, has misinterpreted and misapplied the prohibition of FDA to regulate the practice of medicine. They feel that that is predicated on physicians using cleared devices, that it is for a single physician or a single practice and would not be applicable to large health systems. And there's about 2 or 3 pages of opining on where they think the limitations are and the misunderstandings around regulating the practice of medicine in this LDT final rule. What I think we can expect is that because right now there is virtually no regulatory adult in the room when hospital systems are developing AI systems. They have no controls right now, practically speaking, because they're not required under 21 CFR Part 807 to register with the FDA as manufacturers and developers. And they don't get, by virtue of that, they don't get audited or inspected, or they don't submit their products to be cleared. They just go. And it's their own internal processes and risk tolerance that drives what they will publish or what they will release for use in the clinical workflow. And I think what the FDA is saying is you need to be careful that we don't decide at some point to start sticking our noses into the clinical workflow in hospitals and determining that you stepped outside of the strict reading of the statute and that we can regulate things that are there. One clear step might be that they would change 21 CFR Part 807 and require hospitals under certain circumstances to register with the FDA as a manufacturer. One option here, by the way, is the Joint Commission. I know there is an AI project going on at the Joint Commission to see yes.
Can you say what the Joint Commission is?
I can. So the Joint Commission, I mean, it's technically voluntary, but it is a group that sort of provides assessment of hospital practices against a set of standards, safety standards, credentialing standards, and so on. And it certifies those hospitals as meeting those requirements. And it's when they go into a hospital system to do their audits on a periodic basis, they're pretty involved. They're very rigorous. There's quite a bit of territory that they cover. And hospitals that are certified under the Joint Commission have a certain level of, you can have a certain level of confidence and credibility that gets passed on because of these audits. The Joint Commission does not look at how hospitals develop software and systems that support their work and the clinical workflow. But because of the mushroom cloud of AI systems that are now appearing in hospital environments and clinical environments, they are looking at potentially, from my understanding, this is sort of, I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend, that are projects underway at the Joint Commission that might pull some of that into scope. I don't know what the nature of those are, but for those of us that are scared that there is no regulatory oversight for these institutions, the Joint Commission is one option. There may be others, but I tell you, if this continues and if there becomes a large public health event because these systems are not safe enough, I would not be surprised to see the FDA decide that it needs to step in.
Okay, well, on that happy note, we'll stop the discussion of topics. Was there anything else you wanted to mention as we talked? I think we covered our list here. Is there anything else that comes to mind for people to sort of keep an eye on?
No, I guess the only thing I would bring up is just to sort of improve the mood a little bit, is that in spite of the fact that we see standards and regulations moving much slower than the technology, notified bodies, regulatory authorities, including the FDA, FTC, they are bringing skill sets and expertise in-house to be able to understand these technologies much better than they have in the past. And I really do see a lot of critical thinking happening at the agency, and I see a much higher degree of collaboration between the agency and industry and healthcare providers to try to create sensible regulatory requirements and governance over these systems as time goes on. It may seem murky and frustrating right now, but we do see progress, and I'm really encouraged by that.
And look, it's going to be murky because we are in that inflection point technologically, right? I mean, ChatGPT is less than 2 years old as
Right.
a released product, November 30th, 2022. Just think about how much has changed in the last 2 years.
Sure.
It's impossible for these people, for our slow, deliberate, standard legislative process to move at that speed. It's just, you should draft and you're lucky to get comments in 90 days.
Right. And by the way, that is one thing we don't want to leave without saying. Of the 950 systems since 1995 that the FDA has listed as cleared with AI functionality, 0 of them have had continuous learning adaptive algorithms, and 0 of them have incorporated generative AI. Those are battlefields yet to be fought.
Yeah, but exciting battlefields with lots of opportunities, and hopefully we do things the right way. Henry, Eric, thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.